On the 25th of April 1792, a crowd gathered in Paris, expecting a spectacle. Executions in France had always been public performances, long, bloody, and unforgettable. People came not just to witness justice, but to feel it. That afternoon, the condemned man was Nicolas Jacques Peltier, a highway robber whose crime was unremarkable by the standards of the time. What made the day historic was not the man, but the machine waiting for him. For 6 months, authorities had argued over how Peltier should die. A new law had quietly changed everything. From now on, decapitation would be the only legal form of execution. The intention was clear: no more torture, no more prolonged suffering. Justice was supposed to be swift, equal, and efficient. The question was how. An axe or sword, wielded by a human executioner, carried risks. A shaky hand, a dull blade, a second strike, sometimes even a third. So a radical alternative was chosen, a mechanical device designed to remove human error entirely. A falling blade, gravity, precision. By mid-afternoon, Peltier was led to the scaffold wearing a red shirt, the traditional color of the condemned. The executioner secured his body, positioned his neck, and stepped back. There was no ceremony, no build-up. The blade dropped. In seconds, it was over. Technically, the execution was a success. The machine performed exactly as promised. Clean, immediate, efficient. And yet, something went wrong. The crowd erupted not in horror, but in anger. People shouted insults at the executioner. They cursed the machine. Some demanded the return of the old gallows. Others complained that the execution had been too fast, too clean, too clinical. This reaction is easy to misunderstand if we assume the public wanted mercy. They didn't. What angered them was that the guillotine had taken away the experience. There was no prolonged suffering, no visible struggle, no drama. The execution felt less like punishment and more like administration. Justice, stripped of spectacle, felt empty. France, at this moment, was trying to leave behind punishment as theater. The goal was fairness, not entertainment. Equality, not cruelty. But what no one yet understood was that by removing pain and delay, something far more dangerous had been introduced. A method of killing so efficient that it no longer felt like killing at all. And to understand why that mattered, we need to go back 35 years earlier, long before the guillotine existed, to one of the most brutal executions in human history. To understand why the guillotine felt so unsettling, we need to return to a time when executions were designed to do the opposite, to overwhelm, to terrify, and to linger in the mind long after the body was gone. In January 1757, 35 years before Peltier's death, a man named Robert Francois Damiens was taken from his cell in Paris. His crime was attempting to assassinate King Louis XV. The king survived, Damiens did not. What followed was not simply an execution. It was a statement. At just 18 years old, Charles-Henri Sanson, the same executioner who would later operate the guillotine, was ordered to carry out the punishment. Even for a profession built on death, this day was exceptional. The ordeal began with Damien's legs being crushed. His lower limbs were locked into iron frames, while wedges were hammered inward, splintering bone, tearing flesh, and reducing his legs into shattered masses. This was not done quickly, it was done carefully. Next came fire. The hand that had held the knife against the king was burned with molten substances: lead, wax, boiling oil, sulfur, each chosen for symbolism as much as pain. Hell was being enacted on earth. The message was unmistakable. This was what happened to those who challenged the crown. But the punishment did not end there. Red-hot pincers were used to tear chunks of flesh from his body. The wounds were then filled with the same boiling mixture, sealing agony into every open cavity. His body was transformed into a living display of royal authority. Finally, Damiens was tied by his arms and legs to 4 horses, each facing a different direction. The goal was dismemberment. When the horses failed to tear him apart, Sanson was forced to cut through tendons manually. Only then did the limbs separate. According to eyewitnesses, Damiens was still alive. What remained of him was burned. This entire process lasted hours. Crowds watched, Some turned away, many did not. And that was the point. This execution was not about justice. It was about power. It was meant to be unforgettable, to shock the population into obedience, to remind everyone that the state did not merely kill, it dominated. But something unexpected happened. Instead of reinforcing authority, spectacles like this began to erode it. Intellectuals, philosophers, and ordinary citizens alike began to question the legitimacy of a system that relied on ritualized suffering to maintain control. Violence this extreme no longer inspired fear alone, it inspired doubt. Executions like Damien's did not preserve the old order, they exposed it. And in doing so, they planted the seeds for a radical idea, that justice should not humiliate, torture, or entertain, but end life swiftly, equally, and without spectacle. The guillotine would be born from that idea. But as history would soon prove, removing cruelty did not remove danger. It only changed its shape. Executions like Damien's were meant to freeze society in place. They were designed to be so horrific that no one would dare imagine defying the state. But by the second half of the 18th century, something had changed. The violence had become too obvious. Instead of reinforcing royal authority, these spectacles began to expose it. The monarchy no longer looked powerful, it looked desperate. A government that needed hours of torture to make a point was a government that no longer believed in its own legitimacy. This shift did not begin in the streets. It began in books, salons, and private conversations. Thinkers across Europe started asking a dangerous question. If punishment is meant to uphold justice, why does it look so much like cruelty? Philosophers and legal reformers began to argue that pain was not proof of righteousness, that terror did not equal order, that a system relying on spectacle and suffering was not strong, it was unstable. Public executions, once accepted as necessary, began to feel archaic, barbaric, out of sync with an age that was increasingly obsessed with reason, rights, and human dignity. This was not sympathy for criminals. It was skepticism toward the state. The idea slowly took hold that justice should not be theatrical. It should not humiliate bodies in public squares. It should not depend on how much agony a human being could endure before dying. Instead, justice should be consistent, predictable, impersonal. That last word mattered more than anyone realized. Because once punishment becomes impersonal, it stops being a confrontation between the state and a human being and starts becoming a process. By the time France reached the late 1780s, these ideas were no longer confined to intellectual circles. They were leaking into political discourse, legal debates, and public frustration. The old system of crime and punishment was increasingly seen as arbitrary different penalties for different classes, different methods of execution depending on social rank. Beheading, for example, was considered a privilege, reserved for nobles. The poor were hanged, broken, or burned. Equality before the law did not exist, not even in death. When revolution finally arrived in 1789, it did not simply target the monarchy. It targeted the logic behind the monarchy's power. And few symbols represented that logic more clearly than public punishment. The revolutionaries wanted to destroy the theater of suffering. They wanted justice that was fast, uniform, and stripped of ritual humiliation. They believed that by removing cruelty, they were removing tyranny. What they did not yet understand was that cruelty is not the only thing that makes a system dangerous. Sometimes, efficiency is far worse. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, it was not only a rebellion against a king, it was a rebellion against arbitrariness, against a system where power decided guilt and cruelty enforced obedience. The revolutionaries believed they were building something rational, a new society guided by reason, equality, and law rather than fear, and that ambition extended directly into the realm of crime and punishment. Under the old regime, justice was inconsistent. Punishments varied by class, by region, even by the mood of the authorities. Death itself was unequal. Nobles were decapitated. Commoners were hanged or worse. The method mattered as much as the sentence. The revolution promised to erase those distinctions. In May 1791, legislators declared that any death sentence should involve nothing more than the deprivation of life, no torture, no prolonged suffering, no symbolic mutilation. By the end of the year, this principle became law. Every person condemned to death would have their head cut off. By the standards of the 18th century, this was radical. The death penalty was no longer meant to be an instrument of terror. It was redefined as a legal outcome, cold, neutral, and universal. Justice was supposed to act swiftly and then move on without ceremony or cruelty. But there was a problem hidden inside this ideal. The law specified what should happen, not how it should happen. Beheading was easy to mandate on paper. In practice, it was unreliable. Human executioners made mistakes. Blades slipped, necks required multiple strikes. A sentence meant to be swift could easily turn into a public disaster. And in a system built on equality, inconsistency was unacceptable. The revolutionaries wanted executions that were uniform, identical, free from human variability. No skill, no mercy, no error, just outcome. What they were really asking for, without fully realizing it, was automation. A method of killing that removed the individual executioner from the moral equation and replaced judgment with mechanism. A system where death was delivered not by a person, but by a process. At the time, this seemed humane, even progressive. If the state must kill, they reasoned, it should do so cleanly, efficiently, and without spectacle. Pain was no longer the point. Equality was. But by reducing execution to a standardized procedure, the revolutionaries crossed a quiet threshold. They transformed death from a moral act into an administrative one. And once killing becomes administration, the only remaining question is how often it should be done. That question would soon have a terrifying answer. Once the revolutionaries committed themselves to equal and painless execution, they faced a problem they could not solve with ideology alone. Human beings are inconsistent. No matter how skilled an executioner might be, manual beheading was never guaranteed. Blades dulled, arms tired, necks varied in thickness and posture. A sentence intended to be swift could collapse into chaos in front of a crowd. And chaos was unacceptable in a system claiming moral superiority over the old regime. If justice was to be equal, then death itself had to be standardized. One strike, one outcome, every time. This is where the logic shifted decisively. Rather than asking how to make execution more humane in intention, the revolutionaries began asking how to make it more reliable in practice. And reliability, by definition, required removing the human element. Among those who understood this best was Charles-Henri Sanson. Decades earlier, he had participated in the execution of Damien. He had seen firsthand what happened when punishment relied on endurance, improvisation, and physical force. Now older, more experienced, and deeply aware of public reaction, Sanson understood that human error was no longer tolerable. Around this time, a physician and political figure named Joseph Ignace Guillotine proposed a solution. His position was ironic. He opposed the death penalty in principle, but if executions were to continue, he argued, they should be carried out by a simple mechanical device, one that delivered death instantly and without variation. The idea was met with ridicule. The public found the notion absurd. A machine that killed people seemed cold, unnatural, even cowardly. Songs mocked Guillotine's proposal. Lawmakers laughed him out of the room. The concept felt too modern, too detached, too gentle for criminals who were still widely seen as deserving suffering. But Guillotine's argument had one advantage no one could dismiss. It worked. As debates continued, the revolutionaries realized they had no alternative that matched their own criteria. They wanted equality. They wanted speed. They wanted certainty. And they wanted executions that could not spiral into spectacle or failure. Reluctantly, they returned to the idea they had mocked. Guillotine himself refused to build the device. His name would later be attached to it anyway, but the machine was designed by others, engineers, and physicians working under strict specification. It was not meant to inspire fear. It was meant to eliminate variables. A falling blade, gravity, nothing more. At this stage, the guillotine was still an abstraction, a technical fix to a moral problem. Few understood what would happen once such a solution was placed into the hands of a revolutionary state under pressure. They believed they were perfecting justice. In reality, they were perfecting execution. The guillotine was not born as a symbol. It was born as a solution. Once the decision was made to eliminate human variability from execution, the remaining task was technical. The machine had to work every time. It could not hesitate, it could not fail. It had to deliver death instantly, regardless of the size, strength, or position of the person beneath it. Early prototypes were tested in secrecy. Before a single living person was placed under the blade, the device was used on animals and corpses. The goal was consistency. Engineers and physicians observed how flesh, bone, and muscle responded to the falling weight. Adjustments were made. Angles were recalculated. One design choice mattered more than any other: the blade itself. Instead of a straight edge, the guillotine used an angled blade. This reduced resistance on impact, concentrating force at a single point before slicing cleanly through the neck. A heavy weight was added to ensure that gravity alone delivered sufficient power. Nothing was left to chance. Unlike an executioner, the machine did not tire. It did not panic. It did not feel hesitation or disgust. Once released, the blade always fell the same way. From a purely mechanical standpoint, it was brilliant. By late 1791, Charles-Henri Sanson and his team were convinced the device could deliver exactly what the law demanded: a swift, uniform death. When Nicolas Jacques Peltier was executed in April 1792, the machine proved itself in public. It worked. No second strike was needed, no correction, no delay. The blade fell, and the sentence was complete. To lawmakers, this was confirmation that they had succeeded. They had created a method of execution that aligned perfectly with revolutionary ideals. Equal, efficient, devoid of cruelty, but perfection carries a hidden cost. By removing struggle, error, and human involvement, the guillotine transformed execution into a repeatable action. It reduced death to a function that could be performed again and again with minimal effort. One body after another, no adjustment required. What had once been an ordeal now became a procedure. At this stage, the guillotine was still rare, a novelty, a technical achievement. But its true significance was not in how it killed a single person, it was in how easily it could kill many. The revolutionaries believed they had solved the moral problem of execution. What they had actually solved was the logistical one. And soon, logistics would matter more than morality. The true danger of the guillotine did not reveal itself on the day it first worked. It revealed itself when France began to need it, again and again. By 1793, the revolution had entered its most unstable phase. External wars, internal paranoia, and political infighting transformed fear into policy. Suspicion became enough, accusation replaced evidence. Justice no longer asked whether someone was guilty, only whether they were useful or dangerous to keep alive. This was the moment the guillotine stopped being an innovation and became infrastructure. Executions accelerated. What had once been an extraordinary event became routine. People were processed in groups. Names were read. Sentences were delivered. The blade fell. Then it fell again. And again. At peak efficiency, a single machine could execute multiple people per minute. Dozens in a single session. Thousands over months. There was no need to pause, no need to recover, no need to reflect. The machine did not know who stood beneath it, and the system no longer cared. This is where the logic of humane execution collapsed, because the guillotine did not make death rare, it made death manageable. By stripping execution of suffering, it stripped it of resistance. There was no dramatic struggle to slow the process, no spectacle that forced the public or the state to confront the weight of what was happening. Death became quiet, procedural, and shockingly easy to authorize. The threshold for killing dropped. People were no longer executed for crimes alone. They were executed for associations, for words, for suspicion. The guillotine did not discriminate, it simply performed. In just over a year during the Terror, tens of thousands were put to death. Not through rage or chaos, but through organization. Schedules, lists, systems. The revolutionaries had once feared the cruelty of the old regime. Now they had created something far more efficient than cruelty. They had created a method of killing that required no hatred at all. This was not justice driven by anger. It was justice driven by throughput. And once a state learns how easily it can remove human beings from existence, the question is no longer whether it should use that power, but how often. At first, the guillotine shocked people. Then it fascinated them. Eventually, it blended into daily life. What began as a tool of revolutionary justice slowly transformed into a public routine. Executions were no longer rare disruptions. They were scheduled events, predictable, expected. Crowds gathered not out of outrage, but habit. Vendors appeared near the scaffold selling food, drinks, and printed lists of the days condemned. People ate while they watched. Conversations continued as the blade rose and fell. Death became background noise. This was not cruelty in the traditional sense. It was something quieter and more corrosive. The repetition dulled moral instinct. When killing happens every day, it stops feeling exceptional. It stops demanding reflection. The guillotine turned death into a visible but emotionally distant process. Heads fell, baskets filled, and the crowd went home. Dark humor followed. Jokes spread through Paris, comparing the guillotine to a barber's razor. People laughed that it cured headaches, stopped hair from turning gray, preserved youthful pallor. The machine was given affectionate nicknames. It became a symbol not just of fear, but of familiarity. This was how society adapted. The guillotine did not only kill bodies, it reshaped behavior. It taught people how to live alongside mass death without confronting it. When killing is framed as lawful, clean, and efficient, outrage becomes inconvenient. Even politics adjusted. The machine came to represent revolutionary equality itself. Rich or poor, noble or commoner, everyone died the same way. The symbolism was powerful. When King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, it confirmed the idea that no one stood above the law. But symbolism has a dark side. Once death is equal, it also becomes easier to justify. The guillotine did not ask why someone was condemned. It only required that they be condemned. And the public, conditioned by routine, stopped asking questions too. What was once a moral boundary became a logistical one. As long as the lists were full, the machine kept working. And for a time, almost no one stopped to ask what that meant. For decades, the guillotine defended itself with a single claim: speed. The blade fell fast enough, it was said, to spare the condemned from suffering. Death was immediate. Consciousness ended at the moment of impact. Whatever horrors came before, the final instant was merciful. But this assumption was never as secure as it seemed. Almost from the beginning, physicians and observers noticed something unsettling. Heads did not always behave like lifeless objects once they fell into the basket. Eyes moved. Faces twitched. Muscles responded. In 1793, when Charlotte Corday was executed, her severed head was lifted and struck across the face. Witnesses reported that her cheeks flushed, as if reacting to humiliation. At the time, this was dismissed as imagination, superstition, or nerve. But the observations did not stop. In 1795, the physician Samuel Thomas von Summering argued that consciousness might persist after decapitation, possibly for minutes. He suggested that the brain, deprived of blood flow, did not immediately shut down. If air still circulated, he claimed, the severed head might even be capable of speech. These ideas were disturbing not because they were proven, but because they were plausible. More than a century later, in 1905, another execution revived the debate. A physician named Gabriel Boriot attended the guillotining of a man named Langui. Immediately after the blade fell, Boriot called out the man's name. The eyelids lifted. The eyes focused. Boriot called again. Once more, the gaze returned, calm, deliberate, unmistakably attentive. Only after a third call did the eyes close permanently. Boriot later wrote that what he saw was not a reflex. It was recognition. Whether these accounts represent true consciousness or residual neural activity remains unresolved. Modern science still cannot say with certainty how long awareness might persist after sudden decapitation. But the uncertainty itself is the problem. The guillotine's moral foundation depended on certainty. The certainty of speed, the certainty of painless death. the certainty that suffering ended instantly. If even a few seconds of awareness remained, the entire justification collapsed. The machine that was meant to eliminate torture might have created a different kind of it, one where the mind survives just long enough to understand what has happened, but not long enough to respond. Silent, trapped, aware. The guillotine promised mercy through mechanics. Instead, it introduced a new fear, that efficiency does not guarantee humanity, and that a clean execution can still conceal profound suffering. By the 20th century, this discomfort could no longer be ignored. The blade was fast, but it was no longer unquestionable. By the 20th century, the guillotine no longer inspired revolutionary pride. It inspired unease. The same qualities that once made it appealing, precision, reliability, efficiency, now felt morally hollow. The machine did not terrify because it was violent. It terrified because it worked too well. Philosophers began to articulate what history had already demonstrated. In 1957, Albert Camus argued against the death penalty, focusing particular attention on the guillotine. His criticism was not emotional, it was structural. A hanging, he wrote, at least contained the possibility of failure. A rope might slip, a knot might break. There was uncertainty. The guillotine offered none. To be led to the machine was to know that it would function exactly as designed. The condemned were not facing another human being capable of hesitation or error. They were facing a system, a device, an outcome that had already been decided long before they arrived. Hope was removed along with pain. That, Camus argued, was what made the guillotine especially cruel. Not the blade itself, but the absolute certainty it imposed. In 1977, France carried out its last execution by guillotine. The condemned man was Hamida Jandoubi, sentenced for kidnapping, torture, and murder. The machine performed its task one final time, just as it always had. Shortly after, the death penalty itself was abolished. The guillotine did not disappear because it was medieval. It disappeared because modern society finally recognized what it had become. A tool that transformed killing into administration. A machine that removed emotion, hesitation, and moral friction from the act of taking a life. A device that proved something deeply unsettling. When death is made clean, fast, and efficient, it becomes easier to authorize and easier to repeat. This is why the guillotine was worse than it appears. Not because it caused more pain than other methods, but because it removed the barriers that once made killing rare. It allowed states to kill without rage, crowds to watch without horror, and societies to adapt without protest. The blade did not corrupt France. It revealed what happens when morality is replaced by process. And that lesson, unlike the guillotine, has never disappeared.